This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Gurian. And isn't this exciting? I'm back for a second season. For those of you joining me for the first time, I'm thrilled to have you. If you get a chance, please do go back and listen to everything that came before this, because I took this pretty insane road trip across Europe and Asia, and I think you'll enjoy hearing about everything that happened. For the rest of you, welcome back. This season will be a bit different from the last, because I'll be telling individual stories from my travels instead of just focusing on one big trip. I heard some complaints that the first season sometimes felt like a podcast about what happened to Scott and Drew's car now, and I totally get that. So you'll be thrilled to hear that the stories of car trouble are over. You're welcome. I'll admit I was getting pretty tired of it myself. Several of you have asked if I would ever consider going on a journey like that again, and I've said I would, with a few important caveats. First of all, I'd want a much more reliable vehicle, of course, but aside from that, I've concluded that I'd like to travel at a much slower pace in the future. I mean, I've always preferred to spend more time in a single location to really get to know it well, instead of going on a whirlwind tour. And that's especially important for the type of journalism I'm aiming for, because if I'm just breezing through a city, it's hard to venture away from the touristy neighborhoods, meet people, understand the local culture, and find the sorts of below-the-surface stories I'm looking for. So that's my resolution going forward, to slow down and make a habit of overstaying my welcome. I recently returned from Belfast, where I spent several weeks, and before that, I was in Lima, Peru for nearly a month. By staying there so long, I was able to find some really cool stories I wouldn't have otherwise found, and I'm looking forward to sharing them with you in the coming months. Finally, I should let you know that while many of the episodes this season may be a bit shorter than they've been in the past, they're going to come out every other week on a much more regular and predictable basis, which I think you'll be happy to hear. Okay, now for this week's show. Those of you who listened to my last episode probably remember how it ended. After driving 11,000 miles from the UK to Mongolia and then crossing over into Russia, my brother Drew and our friends Jane and Rosie were thoroughly exhausted and had had their fill of adventure, so they flew home. Meanwhile, I don't know what this says about me, but I wanted to keep going. I mean, I'd never been out of the country for that long before, but I didn't feel any sense of homesickness. Somehow, it just didn't bother me. And I figured that if I was already on the other side of the world, I might as well spend some more time traveling to continue gathering stories for this podcast. So I decided to drive Jane's car all the way back. Now, before you ask, I should clarify that I didn't return the same way I came. That would have been totally bonkers and would have been super complicated to arrange with getting more visas and everything. Besides, I wanted to see another part of the world that I hadn't gotten a chance to see on the drive east. So I hatched a plan to head back across Siberia. Then I contacted my friend Donna, who was house sitting in Denmark, and she flew out to meet me and keep me company on the journey. Now, I don't know what I was expecting, but central Russia turned out to not exactly be the most fascinating or enjoyable part of the world, though I do have some interesting stories I'll share with you later this season, but I'm going to skip a bit ahead this episode to later in our travels. We were planning out our route as we went along, and at a certain point we had a decision to make. After leaving Moscow, Donna wanted to continue up to St. Petersburg and then head down through the Baltics. But after spending several weeks driving across Russia, I was kind of sick of it by that point and wanted to get out. Plus, I had a better idea, so after some conversation, I managed to convince her to head south instead. I'd always been curious to visit Ukraine, partially because my mother's ancestors came from that region, but also because there was one particular place I was eager to see. You might have watched the recent dramatic miniseries about it on HBO.
You are dealing with something that has never occurred on this planet before.
Chernobyl is on fire. And every atom of uranium is like a bullet, penetrating everything in its path. Metal, concrete, flesh. Now, Chernobyl holds over 3 trillion of these bullets. Some of them will not stop firing for 50,000 years.
So that's pretty scary stuff. And like most people, I initially had this fear that surely this can't be a safe place to go, even now, more than 3 decades after the disaster. In fact, I assumed that it probably wasn't even possible for an outsider to get anywhere near it. But I did some research online and learned that not only was it possible, but there are in fact a number of companies that take visitors on day trips to the site. Their brochures claimed that as long as you followed the tour guide's instructions and don't wander anywhere you're not supposed to go, the dose of radiation you'd get from spending an afternoon in the area around Chernobyl was just a fraction of what you'd get from a long airplane flight. So early one Saturday morning, Donna and I showed up at the tour departure site just off Maidan Square in downtown Kiev. The folks from the tour company were waiting for us in a van that had yellow and black radiation warning symbols and a photo of a young girl wearing a gas mask. Not surprisingly, access to the area around the reactor, known as the exclusion zone, is tightly controlled, so we had to show our passports as identification and sign our names on a form, agreeing to a long list of rules. For our safety, we weren't allowed to wear shorts or sandals, touch any trees or plants, or eat or smoke anything outside of certain areas. I asked Donna if she had any concerns.
How are you feeling?
I'm fine.
Are you nervous at all? Or?
No.
Really? Not at all? Not the least bit?
No.
Really? I think most people would be, probably.
Listen, I've exposed myself to plenty of dangerous things. Chernobyl is the least of them.
What compares to...
Nuclear radiation? I don't know. Some men.
All joking aside, she acknowledged a few minutes later that this was, in fact, a pretty serious matter affecting thousands of people's lives. But when you're dealing with such a horrible tragedy, it's hard for many people not to approach things with at least a bit of dark humor. Even our guide Daria, who introduced herself and then handed us off to her colleague Igor to collect the balance of our tour fee. That was his job, she explained.
Because I don't like dealing with money. I'm not afraid of radiation, I'm afraid of money, which is not mine.
Igor took our payment, then handed me my own Geiger counter to measure the radiation.
So I give you the Geiger.
Okay.
To make it work, you have to press the button.
Okay.
To stop it work, just leave it. It turns automatically off.
It turns
in 3
off
minutes.
after a few minutes. Okay.
I tested it out.
So it's this little yellow plastic thing. I think this is pretty simple as far as Geiger counters are concerned. And it lists the current radiation level. So here we are in downtown Kiev, and it's 0.14, I think they call them microsieverts or something. So I'll keep an eye on it as we head over to the affected area and see how that changes.
A few dozen other people began to arrive, and I was curious to hear what attracted them to this tour. Ian was an American living in Germany.
When I was a kid, I watched the documentary Life After People, and they show Chernobyl as like the epitome of like what happens to a society after like people leave it, because it was abandoned for like 30 plus years. Always wanted to come here since I was like 17, I guess. So finally got to a point like living in Germany where I had the time to like go. I think it's a good thing for Ukraine tourism too. I was a tourism major in college, so I think this will do a lot for the economy eventually, and I wanted to do it before it like becomes really big.
I mean, it's weird, like, on the one hand, like, helping Ukraine's economy with tourism. I guess it's important to kind of learn from the mistakes, what happened, and kind of see, you know, all of it. On the other hand, it seems like it's kind of, like, weirdly voyeuristic or something. Like, this is a horrible tragedy, and I feel weird, like, gawking at it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, like, the worst, like, man-made tragedy of all time. But I mean, people travel all over the world to see like worse things like that, like the killing fields in Cambodia. You know, like at least they're making something out of it right now.
Right. What do you think it'll be like? Kind of depressing, I imagine.
I think there's like an eerie beauty in like the abandoned, just seeing something untouched. You know, something that not a lot of people see like now.
I think it'll be fascinating for sure.
I'm definitely excited.
Victor was a Canadian living in Sweden who came on the tour with his college-aged son, Jonathan.
I've been to the Ukraine before, and this is just one of the things you have to do in life to understand 245,000 years of potential contamination. I mean, Europe could have been wiped out as a result of this. So I've never been a great proponent of atomic power.
I think it's monumental. Jonathan and I were recently in North Korea, and I think that's also a place everybody should go to and get appreciation, the other side of the story. It's not the whole story they give you, but it's like here, you don't get the whole story until 30, 35 years after the events.
So you're pretty adventurous travelers.
No,
you don't consider. When people hear North Korea, Chernobyl, the average person wouldn't go to places like that, right?
Well, that's part of the problem today. We're in a situation where people often don't know what's happening outside their own county. So it's good to travel, get perspective on things. I was in the Soviet Union, my first trip was 71, and when I was going to go there, everybody said to me, you can't go there, and if you do that, don't bring a camera, and if you bring a camera, don't go out at night. Well, it turns out I went out at night, and I walked on any bloody street I wanted, even though I was a journalist. There's a plethora of fear, and I think by traveling you get a perspective on this. Not quite the way everybody reports things. You get your own slant.
After they checked everyone's IDs, we all boarded the bus, and as we began heading to the site, they showed us some archival news footage from when the disaster occurred in late April of 1986.
The first word that something was seriously wrong came from this power plant in eastern Sweden, where workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation on their bodies. Although the levels were not high enough to harm humans and no accident had occurred at that plant, it was shut down. And as tests were conducted, similar puzzling reports of high radiation came in from all over Scandinavia. But still, no accidents were reported, leading to the conclusion that the problem was elsewhere, to the east, in the Soviet Union. A fact confirmed to the Soviet people on television tonight.
In case you haven't seen the HBO miniseries, I'll sum up the basics for you. The explosion was a result of poorly trained personnel operating a reactor whose design was flawed from the very beginning. Among the problems was that, like many nuclear reactors in what was then the USSR, it lacked a concrete containment dome to help prevent radiation from leaking in the event of an accident. That's what had kept the partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania 7 years earlier from being far worse than it was. Chernobyl released radioactivity 100 times greater than the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Though the plant was located just 60 miles north of Kiev with a population of 2.5 million people, the winds thankfully carried the radioactive dust cloud over a more sparsely populated region of Belarus before drifting towards Western Europe. Still, cancers and birth defects would impact millions of people in the decades that followed, and some areas will remain contaminated and uninhabitable for thousands of years to come. After driving a couple of hours, we arrived at the outer edge of the exclusion zone, a ring around the reactor site that's nearly as large as the state of Rhode Island. There was a passport control, which had a red traffic light and a gate blocking the road. I filed off the bus with everyone else and got in line behind Victor, waiting for a guard in a booth to check our IDs against the names on his list. I turned to our guide, Daria.
So this is the outer checkpoint, and then we go through 2 more checkpoints as we get closer.
Yes, several more checkpoints.
Why do you think they're so careful about passport control? What are they worried about?
About illegal tourism, because there can be some other illegal activities like hunting, fishing, and so on.
Tell me, who would go hunting and have animals that have been contaminated?
There was illegal hunting. For example, wild horses came very close to the roads, and after that several hunters were caught.
People are crazy.
Yes, there are a lot of madmen in the world, and we can't imagine what they really can do.
Back on the bus, we continued driving on a forested road through a dense fog. Along the way, Daria told us more about the history. Overall, close to 120,000 residents from hundreds of small towns in what's now Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were forced to permanently evacuate their homes, she said. Even now, the artifacts of this tragedy continue to haunt the countryside.
We are entering Chernobyl village, the first ghost village on our way. Only 500 people lived here. The first thing we'll see here is the abandoned bus stop. If you look around, you'll see some abandoned houses in Chernobyl. Buildings collapse one by one every year, and trees grow higher and higher. All the species of animals like living here even if they are sick, even if they have cancer and other diseases, they prefer this place because there are not many human activities here. They prefer radiation to pollution, noise pollution, light pollution, and other things humans can bring with them.
A few miles down the road, we came to another abandoned village called Zalisi. This time we stopped to get off the bus.
Now this way, please.
We're walking on this little path now over to where all these abandoned houses are. There's this house that's totally overgrown. There's trees that have kind of taken over. The roof looks like it's all caved in. Hasn't been lived in many years, clearly. Wow.
Donna turned to me.
It's kind of eerie.
Oh, it's totally eerie. Yeah. And so we walked up here. There's this huge building with columns. It says on the top, 1959.
Daria explained to us that during the time of the USSR, religion was outlawed, so instead of a church being the central gathering place in a community, so-called palaces of culture, like this one, were built.
These were halls, like community centers for interesting lectures about the brilliant future of communism. Let's have a look inside, but be very careful because the floor is very bad.
We filed in the entrance, stepping gingerly over giant holes in the wooden floorboards. Tiles had fallen down and piles of paint chips were scattered about. After passing through what seemed like a lobby sort of area, we entered a large auditorium with a stage. I could still see decorative molding on the plaster walls, and it appeared as though there were once giant chandeliers hanging from the ceiling.
Looks like it was a beautiful building at one point.
But now the windows were blown out, so there were leaves on the floor, and it looked like animals might have been living in there. Daria pointed to a big red banner hanging at the front of the room.
This nice hall was full of posters with propaganda, and this slogan means long live communism, future of all the mankind.
It was hard to ignore the symbolism of the scene before us, since both this building and the political ideology that was preached within its walls were now in ruins. Looking back, Mikhail Gorbachev would one day say that Chernobyl marked a turning point that hastened the collapse of Soviet communism just 5 years later. The Kremlin's slow and inadequate response to the disaster created widespread mistrust in the government, and whatever confidence people had in their leaders would quickly dissipate. But even today, Daria said the Russian government refuses to take responsibility or pay any sort of reparations to the victims.
Russia would never recognize that it was their fault, because it was the policy of the Soviet Union that caused the Chernobyl disaster. Documents proving the mistakes in the construction of reactors of this type were top secret, and people who worked there didn't know about the mistakes in the construction of the reactor. They thought it was absolutely safe.
And she said that culture of secrecy made things even worse by creating a sense of panic.
If the Soviet government started to speak up about the accident, it had to be something extraordinary.
Because they would never talk about anything.
Yes, sure. Because in the Soviet Union, everything was hidden, even the worst things. And you can imagine the fear for all the people. If Soviets spoke about an accident, it had to be a tragedy, an apocalypse. So my friends, when they knew that I got this job, those who are younger, they said, wow, you work in Chernobyl. Those who are older than 40, they said, you crazy. Because they read all the articles, they saw all these TV programs, they felt all this atmosphere of paranoia, and they were afraid of it. They are still afraid of coming here.
How old were you when Chernobyl happened?
I was 3 years old.
Okay.
I don't remember too much. I remember only that my mom took me to southern Ukraine first and then to Moscow. Iodine 139 or 131, I don't remember. It's very light and people could inhale, ingest it, and children are especially sensitive to it, and it causes thyroid cancer. And there was very much radioactive iodine in the air in Kiev, so people had to take their children out of this place.
In the years following the disaster, more than 500,000 people, mostly from the military, were involved in the cleanup process. They became known as the liquidators, and many of them would later get sick or die from radiation poisoning. A scientific study found that children they had after Chernobyl had a 7-fold increase in chromosomal abnormalities compared to their older siblings. While the cleanup ended in 1991, there are still thousands of people working in the exclusion zone to monitor radiation levels and keep them under control, along with scientists conducting experiments to track the effects of radiation on wildlife, and guards to keep out illegal hunters and people scavenging for scrap metal or firewood. I was also surprised to learn that there are still more than 100 permanent residents scattered in villages throughout the outer part of the exclusion zone. These are elderly people who refused to leave or insisted on returning despite being warned of the potential health risks.
The government decided to let them live the rest of their lives here. We call them self-settlers. So they get mail and pension here. Postmen bring them twice a month. In Chernobyl, they have shops, medical assistance, and in the villages they have to take water from wells to chop their own wood. These activities are not allowed in the zone, but these people don't care, and the government closed its eyes because anyway, they are more than 80 years old. They can do whatever they want.
She said they don't have as many health problems as you might expect, and have actually managed to live long and relatively happy lives. Once they die, however, no one else will be allowed to move into the area. Back on the bus, Daria made an announcement as we passed through another security checkpoint, making our way ever closer to the epicenter.
Welcome to the 10-kilometer exclusion zone. Most of the workers of the 30-kilometer zone have never been here. They are not allowed to come here as workers, and they just are not interested in coming here as tourists.
She reminded us of the safety rules in this area, including that we should never sit or put our bags down on the ground, lest they become contaminated with radioactive dust. And she shared the cautionary tale of several tourists in the past who failed to listen and ended up returning to Kiev in their underwear after their clothing had to be confiscated. Strangely, if our shoes became contaminated, however, she said we could simply stomp our feet or wash the radiation off. Our next stop was a former kindergarten in the abandoned village of Kopachi. As we approached the front entrance, I saw a mangled doll half buried among the leaves and what looked like part of a children's plastic toy stove. In retrospect, I think it was when I stepped inside and looked around that the gravity of this disaster really hit me for the first time.
Oh my gosh, this was a school, this was a whole kindergarten in here.
It was a kindergarten, yes.
Wow. There's wreckage of what were kids' lockers here. These things crumbled all over the ground. This is really sad.
The linoleum floor was buckled, and there were giant holes in the ceiling. On one wall, there was a cork bulletin board featuring cutouts of Russian nesting dolls the kids had colored. The floors were littered with pages from workbooks and pieces of games. I wandered into one of the back rooms.
Like a whole nursery here. And a whole row of little beds with springs from all the kids.
This was the clearest sense I'd gotten so far about how people's lives had suddenly and permanently been upended. But in this place, time seemed to stand still, and things were just as they'd been left on the 26th of April, 1986. I was only in there a few minutes, but I couldn't help but be constantly amazed by what I saw.
Oh my gosh. Wow. 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 This is crazy.
I think I was at a loss for what else to say. Listening back to this audio now, I realized that since I was born in 1979, I would have been only a year or two older than the kids here were when all this happened. So had my circumstances been just a bit different, I easily could have been one of them. A little farther down the road, we passed a fire station whose men responded to the Chernobyl explosion without any sort of special protective gear. More than 24 of them would die from acute radiation sickness in the weeks following the disaster. Everyone at the time was paranoid about the threat of nuclear attacks from the United States, Daria explained, but most people were totally unaware of the potential danger from this nuclear power plant just down the road. Finally, there it was.
in front of us we can see a low white building. It's the main building of the power plant. Now, bad news. There is an international rule to prevent terrorism. We are not allowed to take pictures at the power plant. Please stop taking pictures starting from this place.
It was here, in the forests of northern Ukraine, that the Soviets once had grand ambitions to build the largest nuclear power plant in the world. The first reactor at Chernobyl started operating in 1976, and by the time of the disaster, 10 years later, 3 more were in operation, and 2 additional ones were under construction. Eventually, they hoped to build a total of 12 reactors on this site. In retrospect, Daria described it as a Soviet Titanic.
So we've just stopped here and the bus has pulled over. We can walk on the paved road, but they've warned us not to step on the grass like the girl over there is taking a photo, and we're not supposed to be doing that. Apparently the grass is highly radioactive. It's hard because these dangers are all hidden. You can't see anything. And if someone didn't tell you, you'd have no way of knowing that this is contaminated.
It all seemed kind of magical and mysterious, but in case we needed any proof that this wasn't just some sort of elaborate ruse, there, just ahead of us, we had a clear view of Reactor 4, the one where the meltdown had occurred. It was this hulking mass of rusted steel and concrete, now surrounded by multiple barbed wire fences, scaffolding, and giant cranes. At the time of our visit, they were still building a new radiation confinement dome to replace the original sarcophagus, which had been constructed after the disaster but was now starting to crumble. This dome looked like a giant airplane hangar, and in order to limit workers' exposure to radiation, it had to be built off to the side on tracks and then slid into place over the reactor. At 300 feet tall and more than 2 football fields in length, it was the largest movable land-based structure ever built. It took nearly a decade of work and cost close to $2 billion, but Daria said Ukraine thankfully had lots of assistance.
We asked for help, for donations. For example, 30 countries donate money for the project. It's not made only by Ukrainians, because people in the world understand that if the sarcophagus collapses, it will be a problem not only for Ukraine.
We drove a short distance down the street from the power plant to look at the Red Forest, a 4-square-mile area of pine trees that turned reddish-brown and died from radiation exposure within several hours of the accident. The forest was later bulldozed and buried in a special graveyard, and new trees grew on the site, but even today, this remains some of the most contaminated land anywhere in the world. As our bus came to a stop, I noticed Donna's face puckered in an expression of disgust.
What are you sensing or smelling?
It's a very strong taste. It's almost like rust. It's kind of like metal and blood.
I don't taste anything, but it's that kind of a stinging a little bit.
Well, and it's an acidy taste, and my throat hurts. It's very strong since we just drove here.
Yeah.
My senses of taste and smell were nowhere near as sensitive as Donna's, but I was reminded of the time I visited a volcano in Costa Rica, and the sulfur in the air made it feel like I was constantly about to sneeze. Although the radiation around us was still not something we could see with our eyes, our other senses were now warning us that this was definitely real, and it was something we couldn't ignore. Our Geiger counters provided further confirmation.
Okay, let's see the radiation in the Red Forest. 4.3, 5.6.
To put that in perspective, if we stayed there for an hour, we would have absorbed about as much radiation as getting an X-ray at the dentist.
She's walking farther back off the road to get the readings. Her Geiger counter keeps going up.
7.2.
She decided it was best not to go any farther.
There are places where radiation is higher. There are places where it's much higher. There are places where it's lower. It depends.
The good news is that from where we were, even 25 microsieverts, the highest reading Daria got when she pointed her Geiger counter directly at the ground, was still low enough that we'd have to be in that spot for 5 or 6 months to start to have an elevated risk of cancer. At long last, we came to the highlight of our tour, the ghost city of Pripyat. Now, if you've ever seen any photos or documentaries about the aftermath of Chernobyl, I'd be willing to bet it's the images from Pripyat that are seared deepest in your memory, since they're certainly the most compelling. Back in 1970, when construction started on the first reactor, all the workers needed a place to live, so the government built this new town for them 2 miles away from the power plant. Its population quickly grew to 50,000, including 17,000 children, with around 1,000 babies born each year. Now, it was eerily quiet.
So we've just driven up Lenin Boulevard, which used to be the main street in town, and we see on the side giant apartment buildings all vacant and abandoned, with all the windows punched out, totally overgrown. These apartment buildings in what's now the middle of a forest. This really is like an archaeological ruins. And here we are in the town square here. It's just really hard to imagine what this would have looked like when people actually lived here. It was populated and not in disrepair.
This was at the time Ukraine's youngest town, with the average age of the residents just 26 years old. They had a relatively high standard of living, and Pripyat offered most of the amenities you might expect. Hundreds of prefab apartment blocks, 5 schools, a hospital, playgrounds, and stores. Daria showed us around.
The best supermarket in the Soviet Union is this white building, and near it there was a restaurant with a very simple name restaurant, the only one in the town. Over there is a hotel. All the scientific delegations stayed in this hotel after people were evacuated. In another building here, the Palace of Culture Entertainment Center, with a cinema, a theater, a gym, a disco, and so on. And of course a room full of posters with propaganda.
According to the official rules, no one is supposed to enter any of these buildings, but in practice, all the tour companies ignore that, and it seemed pretty likely that the authorities knew this was happening, but simply looked the other way. We walked into the Palace of Culture.
Stepping on shards of glass here. This is amazing. We've just entered this huge theater, really high ceiling. It's pretty dark, except for the bit of light that's peeking in, and just all these cables hanging down. Looks like a lighting rig just kind of smashed to the floor. It's just a mess in here. Very cavernous and kind of damp and chilly in here.
I struck up a conversation with a woman in our tour group.
Can you imagine, like, 200 years from now, someone's going to be walking over our remains?
No.
I hope not. But
I want to get out of here.
Yeah,
now.
It's very creepy. I can't believe they're letting us go here.
Yeah, I think that's a bit crazy that they let us enter this building, because it's
right?
clearly not...
I know. They would never do this back in the U.S. The liability, that's of lawsuits.
They would definitely not do this back in Germany.
Yeah, I'm sure. Ooh, watch the nails.
I think one of the other tourists, a guy from Miami named JC, summed up the atmosphere best.
It has like a very gloomy, dark feeling, you know, because you see the landscapes, you see like the old dolls around like the kindergarten, you see like all these old places, and this is like kind of being in a terror movie. Now we're here, they're real here.
We visited several gymnasiums with torn-up basketball courts, a high school where we saw the music classroom and school cafeteria, and even a giant crumbling indoor swimming pool. But the most incredible sight was an abandoned amusement park that had just been built prior to the disaster. It wasn't actually supposed to open until the 1st of May, but after the explosion, its owners decided to open it a few days early to distract the town's residents and keep them from worrying.
Here's the bumper cars. All kind of banged up and rusted. Some graffiti on them. And there's the ticket booth. Over there's some other kind of ride that you'd sit on that looks like it would swing around. And there's the Ferris wheel over there. All the little yellow cabs still just sitting there.
It's hard to fathom, but for several hours on the afternoon of April 26, 1986, kids were having fun using these bumper cars and riding this Ferris wheel, while there was this enormous danger all around them. The government initially downplayed that danger, so it wasn't until the following afternoon, 36 hours after the initial blast, that they finally issued an order to evacuate. Residents were given just 1 hour to gather their personal documents and prized possessions before boarding buses and trains bound for safer areas. They weren't allowed to take their pets. By early that evening, the city had almost completely emptied out. Government officials told people that this was just temporary and that they'd be able to return in 3 days. More than 30 years later, they still haven't been allowed to move back. Chernobyl was without a doubt one of the most fascinating and amazing places I've ever been, and as much as I love podcasts, I think this is one of those instances where sound alone doesn't even begin to convey what it was like. So I encourage you to visit my website at farfromhomepodcast.org and follow me on Instagram to see some photos and videos I took during my trip. Thanks to Katie McGee, Jessica Williams, and Donna Salter for editorial assistance, and to the Public Radio Exchange for podcast hosting and technical support. Finally, you might have noticed I've got a spiffy new logo this season, and for that, I want to give a shout out to my buddy Matt McNerney for his enormous help. His company, Polemic, designs award-winning experiences all over the world at the intersection of culture, commerce, and community. Find out how they could help your business at polemicdesign.com. Until next time, thanks for listening. If you like Far From Home, you might also enjoy Get Out of Here, the AP's travel podcast. Host Warren Levinson interviewed me in a recent episode as part of a regular feature he does called My Favorite Trip. You could listen or subscribe to Get Out of Here wherever good podcasts are found.